In this lecture, we're going to continue on in the early career of Michelangelo. In the last lecture, you saw the Pietà by Michelangelo, one of his great early achievements, one which made him be compared to the ancients, who were, they believed, able to carve out multiple figures out of one block of stone, just as Michelangelo achieved here. Michelangelo gains a great deal of fame from this project precisely because of this demonstration of being on par with the ancients, and obviously because of the great beauty of this work and its prominent placement within the confines of the Vatican, which led Michelangelo in a way back to Florence, in that the Republican government of Florence, once it had been reestablished after the the eventual burning at the stake of Savonarola and his cronies, the Republican government returned, and the governor of the city, Piero Soderini, asked Michelangelo, along with the building committee of the Cathedral of Florence, to see if he would be able to do something a previous sculptor had failed to achieve. And that was to carve a statue of David for the buttress of the Cathedral of Florence. There was a block of marble that had been brought from Carrara and had just languished outside for 60 years. Because before Michelangelo was on the scene, there was an artist who had been asked to do this sculpture from this block of marble, and he had said that it was impossible because there was a vein running through the marble and that there was no way one could work around it. So time passes, 60 years go by, Michelangelo comes on the scene, and he looks at the same block of marble, and he says that he can do it. And so Michelangelo is given the project, and with it he really tries to prove himself to the people of Florence and to the world that he was capable of creating a colossal sculpture of a nude male. A colossus is anything over life-sized, and that had not been done since the ancient Roman period. And it is a nude male, of course, and that naturally made it connect with the precedents for the male nude in sculpture in the ancient Greco-Roman tradition. So Michelangelo, with this work, is again trying to make himself on par, if not better than, his ancient predecessors. In this work, it is a Christian work, of course, or I should say it is a biblical work. In the context of Florence, a Christian work. David had been, for a long time, a symbol of the Republic of Florence because David was the young boy who had, with great bravery and with the will of God, overthrown the tyrant Goliath by taking his slingshot and hitting Goliath in the head with a rock. He afterwards severed Goliath's head with a sword, and was usually, I should say, shown with the head of Goliath under his feet, or one of his feet. So there were many precedents in sculpture of the figure of David in the city of Florence that Michelangelo certainly knew. But it's clear in this figure that Michelangelo really aimed to do something quite different and express something different about the figure of David, and that's what we'll look at. So something that I said earlier, that this was a figure done for the buttress of the Cathedral of Florence, is a little tricky in that it's true that this sculpture it's certainly true that the block of stone had been intended for the buttress of the Cathedral of Florence, but there's some doubt about when it was that Michelangelo knew that in the end it was not, in fact, going to be placed in the buttress of the cathedral, but instead would be placed elsewhere. And there is a very, very recent essay precisely on this matter. No matter what, when the sculpture was completed, it was lauded in Florence as just this enormous achievement. And Vasari, who we've come across before as the biographer of artists of this period, wrote, "When all was finished, it cannot be denied that this work is carried off the palm from all other statues, modern or ancient, Greek or Latin. No other artwork is equal to it in any respect. With such just proportion, beauty, and excellence did Michelangelo finish it." It was a big deal for this sculpture to be completed and to be colossal and out of one block and be this idealized, strong, virile looking male. It in so many ways echoed what Pliny and other ancient writers had, how they had described the most important sculptures of their period. Another Florentine, Luca Landucci, an herbalist who was keeping a journal, as so many Florentines did, wrote about the delivery, the transportation of the sculpture from Michelangelo's workshop to the place where it was eventually set, which was in the piazza, in the square, in front of the government building. Landucci wrote, "It was midnight, May 14th, and the giant was taken out of the workshop. They even had to tear down the archway, so huge he was. 40 men were pushing the large wooden cart where David stood protected by ropes, sliding it through town on trunks. The giant eventually got to Signoria Square on June 8, 1504, where it was installed next to the entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, replacing Donatello's bronze sculpture of Judith in the Holofernes." So it took almost a month for this sculpture to be moved about half a mile away. And it's precisely those difficulties in its transportation and the limitations of the technology available that's caused William Wallace and others to doubt whether the sculpture was actually ever intended for the buttress of the Cathedral of Florence. And I scoot ahead a little bit so I can show you this image. This is William Wallace's kind of idea of what they would have needed to do and the kind of scaffolding that would have been constructed. And elsewhere he's figured out, along with an engineer and a physicist, exactly what kind of machinery would have been necessary to hoist up such a great distance, such a vertical sculpture as Michelangelo's David, which is about 18 feet tall and multiple tons. And essentially what Wallace has decided is that they did not have the ability to actually get that figure up there. And the question is, when did they know that it wasn't going to go there? And the difference that it makes is that Michelangelo would have made the figure appear quite differently had he really expected it to go up so far above where the viewer would be. And, you know, he would have had to make adjustments to the stature of the figure, probably would have had it maybe leaning over somewhat, or even larger head and hands and such, so that, you know, certain elements of it would be as visible as possible from down here on the ground level. And if Michelangelo knew fairly early on, as it would appear that he did, then knowing it wasn't going to go up there would have been quite a liberating thing for him, and he could approach the figure quite differently and not have to make such dramatic alterations to the figure based on the perspective of the viewer. So Michelangelo had these precedents of David to look at, and we're seeing two of those precedents here. And these are both by Donatello, one in bronze and one in marble. The bronze David had actually been a commission from the Medici family, and this had been placed in their household and was only removed when the Medici fell from power and Savonarola took over. And this was brought to the government building of Florence, Palazzo Vecchio, the building where Michelangelo's David would end up in front of. So this is a major Republican symbol, and the Medici had it in their household as a way to show, that the Medici were in tune with the Republican spirit and they would help fight off tyrants just as David had. They were appropriating that symbol of Florence. But when they were thrown out and the Republican government returned in its full glory, this sculpture, along with another sculpture, David's Judith and Holofernes, which that herbalist Landucci that I just mentioned mentions to us in his account of the placement of Michelangelo's David, were both seen as these, appropriation of Republican symbols, and so they're both taken to Palazzo Vecchio when the Medici are exiled. This David had been in another private residence, but it is more typical in a way of how we would expect David to be represented. Both of them are quite youthful, younger than Michelangelo's David. Both of them are shown after the fact, after David has conquered Goliath, and in fact the severed head is down here at the feet. So the youthfulness of the figure, and this being shown after the fact, and we see David sort of in triumph, or in this case perhaps contemplating his defeat with the thanks of God, is a different moment than what we see Michelangelo depicting. Here instead we have an older David, at least a teenager, who is in this moment before he strikes David in the head with the rock. In fact, the rock is still in his hand over here. And in this hand, instead, he holds the sling, which you can see perhaps better here. By showing him in this prior moment, what we're meant to understand is that David is still contemplating what he's going to do. He may be filled with doubt. He may be supplicating God to intervene and give him the strength to be able to fight off Goliath. But it's not happening yet, and it's not after the fact. It is that moment before we really see David in this moment of contemplation. And that's a critical part of how we see the High Renaissance. It's that moment of reflection that is certainly part of the High Renaissance spirit. And looking at these various images of David that you see here, it shows the viewpoints of David. Obviously, this is a figure fully carved in the round with great detail even on the back side. And that too suggests that Michelangelo didn't ever really think it was going to end up on the buttress of Florence, because obviously none of that would have been visible. So Michelangelo's approach to the figure is very much classicizing. He has the figure shown in contrapposto, exactly as ancient Greco-Roman sculptures were shown, particularly if you think about the sculptures of Polyclitus or Praxiteles. You can see that strong relationship to how the figure is handled. That kind of contrapposto, those opposing opposites, we see all the way through the figure, just as we would have in, say, Polyclitus' spear bearer. We have the head turned in one direction, while the shoulders are frontal. We have the opposites here in the positioning of the arms, and then, of course, the stance of the figure, the way the legs are positioned, is fully in contrapposto. So Michelangelo is keenly aware of those ancient precedents. And then in the treatment of the body, Michelangelo again is really exploring and celebrating the male nude body and the kind of virtues that are associated with the perfected physique that this male has. That outward sign of divine power, of virility, of intelligence. You know, they really understood those, the outer and the inner being very much connected. In fact, even in the facial features of David, we can see that he's got this broad and furrowed brow, um, and the way that his eyes are depicted in particular, but this very chiseled, angular nose and chiseled jaw really are, and the shaggy hair, are meant to recall these ideas that were circulating at the time about physiognomy, that facial features and other bodily characteristics could communicate your inner character. And these characteristics that David shows us were associated with the leonine temperament, the lion-like temperament, so ferocious and fierce and strong and brave. And so those facial features are really meant to communicate those aspects of David to us, much more so than what we see in these 15th century precedents that Michelangelo absolutely would have known well, and Donatello was a sculptor that he very much admired. But you can see how different the treatment is. If you can see, we've got some contrapposto in the figure of David by Donatello, but the treatment of the body is wholly different. The treatment of the moment depicted is completely different. Their age, their stance, the strength that's communicated, it's all, you know, quite different. Michelangelo's conscientiously doing something very new here. Some of those physical characteristics we understand that Michelangelo is learning about through dissection. And I think you can see that particularly well here in this image, where you can see the veins running through the hand and up into the arm, the tendons, the bones, and how they all work together. You know, Michelangelo did do dissections, as we've talked about, and he's using those lessons as he approaches this figure of David. You might notice that the finger of David is broken off here, and in fact the whole arm had been broken off later on in the 16th century when a bench was flung from the window of Palazzo Vecchio in a brawl, and it hit the sculpture that was below. So there was a meeting that took place after the sculpture was complete, and Michelangelo was not part of this meeting. Instead, it's a meeting of government officials, people from the Cathedral of Florence, men of learning from various areas, and several artists. And they convened to decide where the sculpture should be placed. And basically, I mean, though some mention the cathedral buttress, as had initially been the idea, most focus on either placing the sculpture in one of the arches, of the Loggia dei Lanzi, this building over here, or placing it in front of Palazzo Vecchio. Ultimately, it was decided that the sculpture should be placed right beside the portal of Palazzo Vecchio. And part of that decision, at least as we understand it, relates to the fact that because the figure is placed here, the sculpture, let me see, here we go. So if it's placed here, imagine the doorway here, then the gaze of the David is towards the south, and specifically towards Rome. And that is where the Medici family members were exiled at the time. And we can understand, therefore, David as a symbol of the Republic, as a kind of warning sign to the Medici that they should stay out, that the people of Florence, as Republicans, will rise up and fight them off just as David had with Goliath. So that is where the sculpture of David was placed, and it remained there until the 19th century, when, because of weathering and damage because of well, being hit by a bench, for example, they decided that it needed greater protection, and so it was placed inside of the Academia, which is the museum where it still is. Some of the arguments actually for putting it under the loggia were that it would be better protected from the elements there, but ultimately they liked the placement in front of the portal better. So you can see a copy of David has been made and still stands in front of the portal of Palazzo Vecchio. Oh, I should say, this is just sort of a modern day version of David, I suppose. Cute as he is, kind of paunchy. It's just a joke. Anyway, so that brings us to the Palazzo Vecchio. And forgive the misspelling here, remove that C. It's Palazzo Vecchio. So inside of this building that stands behind where David was placed is this room. And I've shown you this room before as I talked about Leonardo, because Leonardo was working here. He was given the commission to do a battle scene that would celebrate the Republic in the same way that Michelangelo's David did. And Michelangelo too was given a project to do here of a different battle scene. Leonardo was not too keen on having this young artist, who was notoriously difficult to get along with, work in the same space and on the same project as he was, and eventually Leonardo abandons the project, and I told you he moves around a bit and ultimately ends up in France, where he dies at the court of Francis I. Michelangelo didn't finish this project either. In fact, we only have his cartoon, like we only have this cartoon after, well, this is a drawing by Rubens after the cartoon that Leonardo had done of the Battle of Anghiari. And this is a copy after Michelangelo's cartoon of the scene that he was tasked with doing, which was the Battle of Cascina. The approach here on the part of Michelangelo to this battle scene is distinctly a different approach than that of Leonardo. As we saw with Leonardo's, you've got, this heat of the moment of battle that's being shown. You've got horses and bodies that are intertwined, these facial expressions that show anguish, determination. It's all really about communicating the struggle involved and the kind of heroism involved in battle. That's not what we see here in the Battle of Cascina. Here instead, Michelangelo is showing us a different aspect of the Florentine troops. And it is that they are ever ready for battle. They can be ready in a moment's notice. And that's shown here because the Florentine troops had been bathing. And we see that they are in the river. In fact, some of them are still working on getting out. Some of them are still reaching up and just will get out in the next second. The rest of them are drying off as quickly as possible and putting their clothes back on. So they had been bathing, and then a horn is sounded, and you can see the horn is being blown right here, which sounds the alarm. And you can see, especially in this figure, this real rush to get ready as quickly as possible and be ready for battle. It was really meant to show the preparedness of the Florentines for battle, and also to communicate their willingness to sacrifice themselves and be ready to battle for the greatness of the Republic. But of course, for Michelangelo, this moment that he's chosen to depict shows us something, again, that he's interested in, which is the male nude form. And we see a huge variety of poses and turns and perspectives of these figures. And Michelangelo kind of uses this as a way to show off his ability to show this wide variety of figures, and his great handling of muscle and form as the bodies twist and move in space. But just to say, I mean, clearly it's hard to say very much about these because we don't have the originals in either case, and we can only look at them through the eyes of these artists who were no doubt, putting their own style into the work. That's certainly the case with the Rubens, and certainly could be the case in this one by Sangallo. They're just, but they're all we've got, so we have to use them as best as we can. Michelangelo was also working for private patrons around Florence, and in particular, it has the commission from the Doni family to do a Tondo, which is this round format image, and in it we see the Virgin, Joseph, the Christ child, St. John the Baptist, and then these nude figures that are in the background that frankly have not been really convincingly identified yet. This round format is quite an interesting format for a private picture, and we think relates to the practice in Florence of having these round decorated trays that were presented to a mother after she's given birth, and it's on which they would offer sweetmeats and wine and things that were supposed to refortify her after her struggle of giving birth. And that we think is appropriate here in particular because we believe that this was painted after Agnolo Doni and his wife Maddalena had given birth to a child whose name was Giovanni, and that child had died, and then there was a second male son that was born, and he too was named Giovanni, and that certainly would explain the presence of Giovanni Battista, John the Baptist, here in the background, and of course he's the patron saint of Florence, so it's not unusual to see him there. This interlocking Holy Family in the foreground is a particularly interesting representation of family unity and strength, which makes sense for such an image as this if it is in fact related to childbirth. And, it is an unusual example of the inclusion of Joseph as an active participant in a scene. We don't really see him that often this way. In the later part of the 16th century, you see Joseph more and more, and he's a major figure in Spanish painting in particular, but before this time in Italy, when you see him, he's usually either in that gesture showing revelation or asleep. So, but here he's really part of the unit, and we understand that he is either passing the Christ child down to the Virgin Mary, or she is raising him up and putting him on Joseph's knee. I think it's most convincing that the motion is going down here and that the Virgin is grabbing the Christ child and will set him in her lap. She has a book on her lap, and it is true that women in Florentine society in this moment were the educators for their children, and they would be the ones that would be given the task of raising the child, giving the child its early education, and that may be what the book symbolizes here. She is a very muscular, very strong Virgin Mary, and that we even see her bare arms is unprecedented and shocking, and especially given that Florentine women never would have shown off their bare arms in this way. But that strength that we see in the Virgin Mary here has been interpreted as reflecting her strength in terms of her moral strength and her intellectual strength, characteristics that were associated with masculinity in this period. And she is really meant to be seen as the athlete of Christ. She is, virtuous and has that muscular toned build, just as we saw David did, and really for the same reasons. So the other aspects of this painting that are interesting, I mean, obviously there's this great monumentality of all of the figures, and also the composition has been arranged, this foreground group has been arranged so that it's quite pyramidal, which suggests an influence of Leonardo, though Michelangelo would probably be loath to admit that. There is a barrier that you can see goes on each side of the Holy Family, and right behind that wall is this kind of strange looking figure of St. John the Baptist, who gazes with longing, really, at the Holy Family in the foreground. He's kind of an odd figure. Then we've got this even stranger element, which is this back wall that kind of goes in a half moon shape. And then these nude figures are cavorting on the wall, and there's absolutely no way to really explain that, though some have suggested that these figures represent the time before Christ, the pagans and so forth, and that John the Baptist acts as a sort of intermediary figure, and then we have the time of Christianity in the foreground. Could be. Others have suggested that the shape of this wall as a kind of half moon relates to the coat of arms of Maddalena Strozzi, which had a crescent moon on it. But as you can see, despite lots of attempts to figure this painting out, it still holds a great deal of mystery. After Michelangelo finishes this painting, he's called to Rome, and it's then that he will enter into the service of a man who was perhaps his greatest patron, the Pope Julius II, and we'll be talking about him in the next lecture.